Montana Territory, July 1877, the sun burned low across the Bitterroot Mountains as Prairie Sutton stumbled through the tall grass, blood drying across her temple and smoke still clinging to her torn doeskin dress. Her feet were raw. Her hands trembled. She had not looked back since the council fire turned against her. She did not want to see the faces that had once called her sister now staring as if she were a ghost. She was 23. And banished. The scar across her cheek, left from a raid she had survived at 15, had marked her as cursed by the elders of her Nez Perce band. A sign of misfortune, they said. A sign the spirits had turned their backs on her. After the drought, the fire, and her brother's death in the same season, they needed someone to blame, so they turned on her. Prairie did not cry. Not when they ripped her necklace from her throat. Not when her own cousin spat at her feet. She had stood tall the way her mother taught her before she died. And she walked. Now the world was quiet but for the buzz of insects and the distant sound of horses. She stopped beside a split-rail fence, unsure if her legs would carry her farther. Her chest ached from breathing too hard. The land opened wide here, rolling fields of golden grass, a small cabin up ahead, smoke rising from its chimney. A man rode toward her. He slowed his horse when he saw her, boots kicking dust as he dismounted. Tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 27 or 28. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, revealing strong arms tanned by sun. His face was weathered but kind, with dark hair falling just above his collar. His rifle was slung across his back, but his hands stayed loose at his sides. "You all right?" he asked, voice low and steady. Prairie blinked. Her throat was dry. "I need water." He nodded once and offered his canteen without a word. She drank and he waited, watching her with quiet care. "I'm Dawson McCrae," he said. "This is my land." "I didn't mean to trespass," she said, handing the canteen back. "I was just walking." "You look like you've been walking a long way." She didn't answer. "Got a name?" he asked. "Prairie," she said. "Prairie Sutton." His eyes lingered on the gash across her cheek. He didn't flinch or look away. "You hurt?" she hesitated. "Not bad." "You hungry?" Her stomach answered for her, loud and sharp. He gave a small nod, turned, and led his horse back toward the cabin. He did not ask her to follow. He just walked, and she followed. Inside, the cabin was one room, clean and warm. A pot of beans simmered on the stove. He handed her a plate and watched her eat like he did not mind the silence. When she finished, she leaned back, hands trembling slightly in her lap. "You want to tell me what happened?" he asked. "No," he nodded again, like he respected that. "Well, you can stay the night. Got a spare cot." "I'll sleep out in the barn." "I don't want to be trouble." "You're not," she studied him. "Why are you being kind?" Dawson met her eyes. "Because you look like someone who's had too much taken already." Prairie looked down at her hands, bruised, calloused, still shaking. He stood, moved toward the door, then paused. "That scar," he said softly, "looks like proof to me, not of a curse, of strength." She did not say anything, could not, but her throat tightened and her eyes burned. He left her alone after that. The next morning, Prairie woke to the smell of coffee and fresh bread. She stepped outside to find Dawson chopping wood by the barn, sweat glistening down his arms. He paused when he saw her. "Morning," he said, "morning. You sleep all right?" She nodded. "Better than I expected." Dawson leaned on the axe handle. "You got somewhere to go?" She looked across the horizon. "No." "Then stay," he said simply. "Why?" "Because you need a place where no one looks at you like you're broken." Prairie's chest tightened again. "You do not even know me," he shrugged. "I know enough." They passed the next few days in slow rhythms. Dawson worked the fields. Prairie helped where she could, mending shirts, feeding the hens, drawing water from the well. She did not speak much, but he never pressed her. He just welcomed her into his quiet world, and somehow it soothed the storm inside her. One night, as the sky turned lavender, Prairie sat on the porch while Dawson carved a piece of wood beside her. She watched his hands move, steady and skilled. "What are you making?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Horse for my nephew, back in Kansas. You come from a big family, used to, parents passed, sister's all I got now," she nodded. "I used to have a brother." He looked at her gently. "You still do." He just isn't here." The way he said it soft, without pity, made her chest ache. She looked away, blinking fast. "You do not ask many questions," she said. "Figure you'll tell me what you want when you're ready." She smiled a little, just for a moment. That night she lay awake on the cot, staring at the ceiling. She could still hear the voices from the fire, still feel the sting of betrayal. But here, under this roof, with Dawson's quiet presence nearby, the pain felt distant. The next morning it rained. Not a hard storm, just a slow, steady drizzle. They sat together inside, Dawson reading an old book while Prairie mended a torn shirt. At one point their hands brushed when she passed him a needle. He looked up. Their eyes held, neither of them spoke. Later, as she stood at the window, watching the rain slip down the pane, she whispered, "They called me cursed." Dawson moved beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. They were wrong. She turned to him. "You do not even know what I did." "Do not need to," he said. "I see who you are now, that's enough for me." Prairie's breath caught. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not since her mother, not since before the scar. She touched it, fingers trembling. "It makes people look away." "Not me," he said. She looked up at him. "Why?" "Because I think you are strong," he said. "And I think anyone who cannot see that is blind." Her throat tightened. She stepped back, afraid of how much that meant to her already, but Dawson didn't push. He just let her be. That night they ate in silence, but it was not heavy. It felt like something building slow, warm, steady. And Prairie, for the first time in weeks, wanted to stay. The rain let up by midday, leaving the earth soft beneath their boots and the air thick with the scent of wet pine and tilled soil. Dawson had gone out early to check on a calf born overnight, and Prairie stood at the edge of the yard with her arms crossed, watching the fields steam under a pale sun. She'd washed the soot from her skin 2 days ago, but the smell of char still clung to her memory. She didn't know what to do with her hands when they weren't occupied. Back with her people, there had always been something: roots to gather, hides to scrape, cousins to hush. Here, the silence pressed differently, not heavy but expectant, like the land itself was watching. Dawson returned with mud up to his knees and a calm look about him that never seemed to shift. He carried a bucket of oats in one hand, his hat tugged low over his brow. "Calf's healthy," he said, setting the bucket down near the porch. "Just needed help finding his legs." Prairie nodded. "You ever lose one?" "Once. Winter came fast that year, couldn't get the mother to stand. I stayed up till dawn trying, didn't matter." She looked at him. "You stayed anyway, didn't seem right to leave her alone." Prairie's gaze dropped to the dirt. "You treat animals better than some people treat their kin." Dawson didn't answer right away. He crouched to wipe his boots against the step, then looked up at her. "You don't have to talk about them." "I know," she said, "but I might one day." He stood. "I'll be here if you do." She followed him to the barn, helping without being asked. She held boards while he hammered, fetched nails from a rusted tin. Her fingers found easy rhythm in the work. It steadied her. By afternoon, she sat cross-legged in the loft, watching him stack hay with slow, practiced movements. Dust drifted in shafts of sunlight, and somewhere outside, a meadowlark whistled. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. Dawson leaned on his pitchfork. "Used to. When I first bought this land, I figured I wouldn't last 3 seasons. What changed?" He glanced up at her. "I stopped waiting for it to feel easy." Prairie considered that. "And now," he shrugged, "now I get up, do the work, and sleep with tired bones. It's not easy." "But it's mine." She nodded slowly. "I never had a choice where I stayed before. You do now." They didn't speak again for a while, and she didn't mind the quiet. It wasn't the kind that accused or judged, it just shared space. That evening, Dawson brought out a canvas sack from beneath the bed, old clothes he'd kept tucked away. Prairie sorted through them by lantern light, choosing a faded skirt and a gray blouse with the buttons mostly intact. She changed behind the curtain that divided the room, folding her torn doeskin dress carefully and setting it aside. When she stepped out, Dawson looked up from the table. He didn't stare or speak right away, just met her eyes, then gave a single nod. "Fits you." Prairie tugged at the sleeve. "I feel strange in it." "You look like yourself," he said, "just warmer." She almost smiled. That night, she pulled the blanket higher up her chest and stared into the darkness for a long time. The cot creaked if she breathed too deep. Across the room, Dawson shifted once in his bed, then stilled. "I never told anyone what happened to my brother," she said softly. There was a pause. "You don't have to," he said from the dark. "I want to." Silence again, but it felt open this time, like a held door. "He drowned," she whispered, "in the river near the cedar grove. He went in after a boy from the bannock who'd slipped, pulled him out, but the current took him." Dawson didn't speak. "They blamed me," she went on. "Said I should have been watching, said the water spirits wanted him instead of the bannock boy. Said I angered them." "That's not your fault," she exhaled, shaky. "Doesn't matter, they believed it." In the silence that followed, a moth flitted against the window pane. "I see you," Dawson said quietly. "And I don't see anyone cursed." She turned her face into the pillow, and for the first time since she'd arrived, let herself cry. By the time morning came, her eyes were dry and her breath came easy. She stepped outside to find Dawson on the porch, sharpening a blade against a whetstone. "I want to work," she said. "Not just help, I want to earn my keep." He looked up, then handed her a pair of gloves. "We'll start in the west field, soil's thick after the rain." She followed him through the gate, the sky wide and clean above them. As they walked, he glanced at her again. "You ever plowed before?" "No, but I learn fast." He smiled, not wide, but enough that it reached his eyes. "Good, you're gonna need to." And just like that it began, not a new life exactly, but the beginnings of one. The kind built slow, with calloused hands and shared silence. The kind that didn't ask for more than truth. And for once, Prairie had nothing left to hide. By August, the earth lay cracked in places, the fields breathing dust under a sky that hadn't offered rain in 14 days. Prairie stood at the edge of the corral, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hair tied back with a strip of canvas. Her hands were raw from lifting fence rails and packing salt blocks, but she never asked for less. Dawson leaned against the gatepost, studying the new foal that had come too early. Its legs trembled beneath it still, but it drank. That was something. "He gonna make it?" Prairie asked, voice low. "Hard to say," Dawson replied. "He's got the will, sometimes that's enough." She nodded once and stepped back into the sunlight. They hadn't spoken much the past few days, not out of distance, but rhythm. They moved in quiet tandem now, like two oxen pulling the same yoke. That morning, she'd taken over the butchering with steady hands. She hadn't flinched when the sow kicked twice before settling. Dawson had watched her from the smokehouse doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. Afterward, he handed her a clean cloth and a square of bread. She sat beside him in the shade, and they ate without words. Near sundown, she carried a bucket to the well and found him bent over the grindstone, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. She paused, watching the blade catch light as it turned. "You ever been in a fight?" she asked. He looked up, surprised. "Not since I was 16, he said. "Got knocked flat for calling a man a liar. He was one, but I learned to keep my mouth shut after that." Prairie sat on the edge of the porch, resting the bucket beside her. "I broke a boy's arm when I was 12. He spit on my cousin, said we were dirty people." Dawson wiped his hands on a rag. "What your elders say?" "Nothing. My uncle gave me a piece of jerky and said not to waste anger on boys who needed to be taught." He chuckled once, then quieted. "You miss him. Every day." The wind picked up just enough to shift the trees. Prairie watched the sky, pale and wide and empty. "You ever been in love?" she asked. Dawson didn't answer right away. He sat on the step beside her, the wood warm beneath them. "No, not the kind that sticks," he said. "Had a girl once. She wanted a life with fine lace and calloused hands didn't fit that." Prairie traced the grain of the porch with her thumb. "I never had the chance. Anyone interested in me was warned off, said I brought bad luck." He turned his head toward her. "You believe that?" "I used to. And now," she looked at him. "Now I don't know what I believe, but I know I feel more like myself here than I ever did there." Dawson didn't reach for her hand. He just let his knee rest against hers, solid and quiet. The next day, they rode out to the tree line where Dawson had seen signs of a cougar. He handed her his spare rifle, not as a gesture but as trust. Prairie didn't speak as they tracked the scratch marks along the bark and the faint trail of blood from a rabbit. She knelt to study the prints. "Not fresh," she said. "2 days old at least, might have moved on," he nodded. "We'll keep an eye out." They didn't speak much on the ride back, but Prairie caught him glancing at her once, not cautious, just considering. She met his eyes and held them. That night she sat by the fire while Dawson repaired the cinch strap on his saddle. The room smelled of oil and leather and something faintly sweet prairie sage she'd crushed and hung near the window. "Your people name their horses?" he asked. She nodded. "Some do. I had one named Sully." "Means fly fast. He died in a flood 2 winters back." Dawson set the saddle aside. "I've been thinking about building a second barn, something small, for tools and feed." She tilted her head. "Why tell me?" "Because I'd like you to help me build it." Prairie watched the fire flicker, her voice soft. "That mean I'm staying?" He didn't look away. "If you want to." She moved her gaze to the floor, then back to him. "I do." The fire popped and the room held still. Dawson stood then, crossed the room slowly and crouched in front of her. He didn't reach for her, just waited. Prairie's breath caught, but she didn't pull back when he laid his hand over hers. "I don't see the girl they pushed out," he said. "I see the woman who stood up and walked away from the fire." She didn't speak. Couldn't. But she turned her hand under his and laced their fingers together. They sat like that until the embers burned low, and the only sound was the wind pressing soft against the walls. The air turned brittle by mid-September, with mornings crisp enough to see their breath and evenings quiet, but for the rustle of dry cottonwood leaves. Prairie had taken to rising before first light, boots laced tight, hair braided down her back with a strip of calico Dawson had cut from an old flour sack. She moved through the days with purpose, no longer uncertain in her place. The barn rose slowly behind the house, its frame built from pine he'd felled on the north ridge. She stood atop the half-finished rafters, hammer in hand, while Dawson steadied a beam below. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't ended up here?" he called up. "I try not to," she said, sinking a nail clean through the wood. "But sometimes I wonder if I'd have learned to build with my hands instead of always being told to keep them folded." He squinted up at her, jaw tightening in thought. "Seems to me they were wasted then." She climbed down the ladder after the last board was set, hands sore, arms streaked with sawdust. He passed her a strip of jerky and they chewed in silence against the barn wall, the sun hanging low behind them. "I had a job once," Dawson said, brushing sawdust off his trousers. "Before I bought this land. Freight wagon down past Salt Lake, hauling salt and timber. Long days, hard men." "What made you leave?" "The man riding beside me got his leg crushed when a wheel came loose. Boss barely stopped the convoy, said we could come back for him after the load was delivered. I stayed with him. Got docked a month's pay." She watched him with quiet focus. "Was he your friend?" "Not before that, but I reckon he was after." Prairie didn't ask what happened to the man. She could hear what wasn't said. That evening, she shaved curls of wax from a candle stub and packed them into a tin with pine resin and fat fire starters for winter. Dawson sat across the table, mending the handle of a kettle that had come loose in the last storm. The fire crackled low, casting their shadows long across the wall. "You ever miss noise?" she asked, arranging the tins in a line. "Sometimes, late at night, I forget what voices sound like when they're not mine." She rested her hands on the table. "I used to fall asleep to laughter. My aunt's fire always had someone telling stories. Now I can't remember the sound of most of them." Dawson looked at her, not with sympathy but with something steadier. "We could make new ones." She met his eyes. "New stories," he nodded. "New sounds. New ways of belonging." Prairie looked down at her hands, palms rough from work, nails chipped. "You think I belong here?" "I don't think about it anymore," he said. "You just do." Later that week, a rider passed through an older man from a homestead 3 miles east. He brought a sack of dried apples and news of a sick mare. Prairie stood back while Dawson traded advice and offered 2 bundles of willow bark. When the man rode off, Dawson turned to her. He says there's a gathering in town next week. Harvest fair, music, food, dancing. She raised a brow. You planning to go? Wasn't, but I thought maybe you might want to, she hesitated. I don't have a dress. You've got hands, he said, glancing at the folded gingham he'd set aside days ago. And I've got a needle somewhere under that mess of a shelf. She didn't answer, just picked up the cloth and ran her fingers along the edge. The night before the fair, she pressed the seams flat with a warm iron and stitched a patch at the shoulder where she'd miscut. It wasn't fine, but it was hers. When she stepped out the next morning, Dawson stopped mid-step on the porch. He didn't speak. Just offered his arm. They rode the wagon into town, the road dry and rutted, the trees lining it turning to gold. Prairie's heart thudded louder than the wheels. She hadn't been around a crowd since leaving the band. Her scars felt sharper in daylight. Dawson seemed to sense it. You don't owe anyone anything, he said, voice low. You stand how you stand. Let them look. The square was filled with sound fiddles and laughter and the scent of roasted corn. Prairie kept close at first, but as the day wore on, her shoulders eased. She bought a jar of honey with 2 eggs and watched children toss corn husks into a barrel for prizes. When the music began, Dawson held out his hand. I don't know the steps, she said. Neither do I, he replied. She let him lead her into the crowd, his palm warm against her back. They moved slowly, unsure but steady. Others spun and laughed nearby, but they stayed close, eyes on each other. You're not who I thought I'd find, she said. He smiled, faint and honest. You're exactly who I hoped I'd meet. I just didn't know it yet. As the tune rose, they turned once more beneath the string of lanterns. Prairie felt the weight of her past loosen, like the knots in her chest had begun to unlace. That night back at the cabin, she stood in the doorway while he banked the fire. She didn't speak. Just watched him. When he turned, she stepped forward, lifted her hand to his cheek. I'm not leaving, she said. He didn't answer. He just leaned in, slow and sure, and kissed her once solid, warm, nothing hurried. They stood like that for a long while, the night quiet around them. And in her chest, something settled like a root finally found its place in the earth. The first frost came quietly, silvering the grass before dawn and leaving the chickens hesitant to step from their coop. Prairie carried the feed bucket in one arm, the other tucked close to her chest where Dawson had pressed a wool scarf around her shoulders that morning before she'd fully woken. Inside, the stove burned low and steady, casting a warm breath through the room. Dawson sat sharpening a drawknife, the tip of his boot resting against the leg of his chair. He looked up when she stepped in, the door creaking closed behind her. You'll need mittens soon, he said, voice still rough from sleep. I can make them, she replied. If I cut the lining from that spare quilt. He nodded once, then ran his thumb along the blade's edge, inspecting it. There's a man who comes through this time of year, Norwegian fella, sells sheep's wool and dyes. Might be worth trading for. She set the bucket down and leaned against the wall. I've never dyed cloth before. I'll show you, Dawson said, setting the knife aside. My ma used to make her own, walnut husks, onion skins, pokeberries. I remember the smell more than anything. Prairie crouched in front of the stove, feeding in a split log. You ever think about your mother much? He was quiet a moment. Only when I do something she'd have liked to see. She had patience I never quite learned. Prairie placed the kettle on the flat top and closed the stove door. My mother used to sing when she worked, old songs. I can't remember the words anymore, but sometimes I think I hear the tune when the wind shifts. Dawson stood, stretching out the stiffness from sitting too long. You hum sometimes when you're stitching. She glanced at him. You never said, I like the sound, he said simply. That afternoon, they cleared the last of the root cellar space, laying the turnips in straw and wrapping the apples in cloth. Prairie found a mouse nest inside a barrel and pulled it out with a steady hand, holding the tiny bodies gently before releasing them at the edge of the field. Dawson watched her from a distance. When she turned, he asked, You ever think about having a place like this for good? She met his eyes. I already do. No, he said, stepping closer. I mean a life, Prairie, not just a place to stop. She didn't answer right away. The wind tugged at her braid, and the smell of damp soil rose from the earth. "I thought I'd never be wanted anywhere again," she said. "But now I wake up and I want to stay." Dawson stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "Then stay for good." "With me?" She turned her palm up, weaving her fingers through his. "You sure you want that?" He smiled gently. "I've never been more sure of anything." They married on a cold morning with frost still clinging to the fence rails. The preacher from town came early, his boots muddy and coat too thin. Dawson wore a clean shirt and brushed hair, and Prairie stood with a sprig of pine tucked behind her ear. The gingham dress newly hemmed with a strip of wool at the bottom. There were no guests but the land itself silent, watching, bearing witness. Afterward, they shared bread and stew in the cabin, laughing over a spilled cup and the preacher's runaway mule. Prairie leaned against Dawson's shoulder as the fire burned low. For the first time, she called it home out loud. That winter, they built shelves for books and jars of preserves. Prairie taught Dawson to carve small tokens from bone birds, fish, the shape of a bear's paw. He made her a comb with the edge smoothed down so it wouldn't catch her hair. She sewed him a pouch for his whittling tools, stitched with red thread from the bottom of an old spool. The days passed slow and sure. When storms came, they read by lantern light, Dawson's voice low as he traced the words. Prairie leaned against him, listening to the rhythm more than the stories themselves. In early spring, just after the first melt, Dawson brought home 2 orphaned lambs from the neighboring farm. Prairie fed them with a rag-wrapped bottle, whispering to them in the quiet hours. By summer, the barn stood finished, the fields full again. Prairie planted a row of sunflowers near the porch. Dawson added a bench beneath the window. One evening, long after the sun dipped below the hills, they sat together under the stars, her head on his chest, his hand resting over hers. "You miss the life you had before this?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "I think that life brought me here. That's the only part that matters." He kissed her temple and she closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of pine and smoke and earth. Years passed, marked not by calendars but by harvests and the soft creak of the porch boards beneath their feet. They built a second room for storing spools and hides, then a third with a cradle by the window. Their daughter was born on a windless night, her cry sharp and strong. Dawson held her first, his hands gentler than Prairie had ever seen. They named her Suli. Prairie watched her grow with wonder, each day a stitch in something whole. She taught her songs, even without the words, and Dawson showed her how to walk the fence line without fear. They lived quiet, without need for more than what they had, a life shaped by choice, by kindness, by the long work of healing. And when Prairie stood beneath the old pine tree with Dawson's hand in hers and their daughter chasing chickens in the yard, she finally understood what it meant to belong not to a place or a people, but to a life made together. They never looked back. They didn't need to. They had everything they needed in the steady rhythm of days, in the warmth of shared silence, in the unshakable truth of love earned and kept forever together in the Montana earth.